Good evening. Let me welcome you to the University of Houston Clear Lake. We're delighted that you took the time and made this special effort to be here this evening for a very special presentation by Dr. Neal Lane. We're delighted that Dr. Lane and his wife Johnny are with us this evening. This is a very special occasion. You've seen the slides on the screen go by, but I do want to acknowledge our sponsors for tonight's event, this special lecture. Major sponsor is the GHG Corporation and its president, Israel Galvan, and I would like Israel to stand up. Israel, will you stand up and we thank you? Also support from the Boeing Company, as well as within the University of Houston Clear Lake, our School of Science and Computer Engineering, our School of Business, the Office of the Provost, and the Office of Sponsored Programs, as well as University Advancement. I have the pleasure to introduce the person who will introduce Dr. Lane. The person that have the pleasure of introducing is one of our UHCL faculty. His name is Dr. David Garrison. He is the chair of our physics program. David is presently an assistant professor here at the University of Houston Clear Lake. He earned his bachelor's degree in physics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and went on to earn his doctoral degree in physics from Pennsylvania State University. He has played a key role, and I really should say the key role, in doing a number of things at this university in a very short period of time. He helped redevelop and revamp the bachelor's degree in physical sciences. He helped introduce the master's degree in physics. He also, among other things, and the latest thing, and we're very proud of this, his efforts along with those of his colleagues, we now have a collaborative master's doctoral program with the University of Houston. And this will allow students from the University of Houston Clear Lake who are receiving master's degrees in physics to make that transition into the PhD program in physics at the University of Houston. But it will involve the faculty from both institutions serving on dissertation committees, offering coursework not only here but at UH as well. And this is a very significant partnership. Dr. Garrison has received numerous awards, various research awards from NASA, the Institute for Space Systems Operation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Council of Graduate Schools, and the Texas Educational Grid Project. Very simply, one of the great joys of being president of any university, and especially the University of Houston Clear Lake, is to have interaction with outstanding faculty members. Please join me in welcoming to the podium one of our outstanding faculty members, Dr. David Garrison.
All right, I'd like to start off by thanking Dr. Staples, and I'd also like to thank the faculty and staff that helped to put this event together. Specifically, I would like to thank the Office of University Advancement, and there's really too many other people to come up with here. I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for attending. I know that not everybody could attend this event that wanted to, so for them and for you guys, we are videotaping this. So there will be a DVD of this presentation in the library and in the university archives afterwards. Before I introduce Professor Lane, I'd like to talk a little bit about the physics program. We were originally founded in 2004, and that's when we started a master's degree in physics. And the focus of our program has mostly been astrophysics related. Specifically, we've had students work in relativity and cosmology, orbital dynamics, astronomy, planetary science, plasma physics, but a lot of our students come to us with a wide variety of interests, and we do the best we can to work with them and move them into the areas that they really, really want to learn more. After the founding of the physics program, we extended the program by developing a professional science master's degree subplan in technical management. This was done thanks to a grant from the Council of Graduate Schools and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. And the idea was to, as the title suggests, train students with technical backgrounds into some type of management positions. And most recently, we've developed this collaborative PhD with the University of Houston. And this is why we're here tonight, and this is what we're celebrating tonight, thanks to Dr. Lane. If you'd like to learn more about the physics program, we do have a booth downstairs, and we have a new booklet that just came out last week, which details a lot more about our program and a lot more about what we're trying to do and what we are doing here. So, and I'd like to talk a little bit about Dr. Lane and to let you know why it is that this is such a great event and this is such a great reason to have him here. Dr. Lane is the Malcolm Gillis University Professor at Rice University. He holds appointments as Senior Fellow of the James A. Baker III Institute for Public Policy, where he is engaged in matters of science and technology policy, and in the Department of Physics and Astronomy. Prior to returning to Rice University, Dr. Lane served in the federal government as Assistant to the President for Science and Technology and Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy from 1998 to 2001, and as Director of the National Science Foundation and member of the National Science Board from 1993 to 1998. Before becoming NSF Director, Dr. Lane was Provost and Professor of Physics at Rice University here in Houston, Texas, a position he held since 1986. He first came to Rice in 1966 when he joined the Department of Physics as an assistant professor and became a full professor 6 years later in 1972. He left Rice from mid-1984 to 1986 to serve as Chancellor of the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. In addition, from 1979 to 1980, while on leave from Rice, he worked at the NSF as Director of the Division of Physics. Dr. Rice received his PhD, MS, and BS in physics from the Oklahoma University. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Dr. Neal Lane.
Thank you very much, David. And ladies and gentlemen, President Staples, I'm so delighted to be on your campus. And congratulations to all my physics colleagues for the extraordinary success of that department. I know it's exciting to think about the new program, and I'm anxious to follow up and see how it goes in the next step and the step to follow. So, one reason I am particularly excited to be here, and let me ask now if I can be heard. Can I be heard? Do you care, actually, whether I can be heard or not? Now, don't answer. That's always a very, very tough question. I had this experience at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs, and that is a campus within a larger system. So I have some familiarity with some of the issues that go with that, and sympathize in some way with what all of you deal with on a day-to-day basis. At the same time, I have a very real appreciation for how important this institution is, and I feel that from my own experience in Colorado Springs, but also knowing about the Houston area, Clear Lake, NASA, the surrounding business community. This community needs an institution like this. You provide access to people to advance their education, which they otherwise would not be able to do, and it attracts to this region and to Texas outstanding people from all over the country, all over the world. So I really appreciate, have a deep appreciation for what you're doing. A little more money wouldn't hurt, but okay. This is my only sort of Rice advertisement, but let me move then to just a quick summary of, I don't know exactly, my background. This is kind of how did Neal get here? And so this is some people's memory of Oklahoma, and I must admit that's probably what got me first interested in science, because in Oklahoma, if you're a kid in Oklahoma in the days we were there, not a lot happens on a day-to-day basis. And so when the thunderclouds roll in and the storms come, It's very exciting. So I was always the last kid to get in the storm cellar and so forth. It's great. Other people think of Oklahoma this way, and this is my sweetheart, high school sweetheart Johnny, and myself moving along. So I went from there to Rice University after some postdocs experience, and then here I am in my physics office. It's a really good experience. There had great graduate students. They did all the work just like the graduate students you are or that you know about. It's really a likeness. It's not really me. I'm not that old. And I don't have that hair either. Then in 1986, after my time in Colorado, I was brought back to Rice to be provost. And a lot of my colleagues said, why would you ever go from a faculty position to be a provost? For goodness sake, what happened to you? It was really the office. I mean, you know, one look at the office, and I thought, boy, I can't. You visit your provost's office, probably roughly like this. Now, I'll tell you how it goes briefly, but I don't have time. This is the provost chair, and provost's not in right now, but when the provost is in, he or she sits in this chair, and then they open the doors, and the deans and the faculty file in here. We call them they're the supplicants, if you like, you know, so they have petitions for faculty salary and new programs. So it was a great job. I loved it. And then one day the White House called, and I said, yeah, tell them I'm out. And but we finally connected, and I ended up in Washington. And so it was a great time. I worked for President Clinton, Vice President Gore. They had a good time together and terrific people to work with the administration. And much of what I'll talk about is based on the experience that I had when I was there and subsequent things that took place. Now I'm back at Rice, and part of the university professor's really nice position. I asked what it was going to be when Malcolm Gillis offered it, and he said, we will pay you a very nice salary, and you can do anything you want. And I thought, well, that's terrific. I never had a job like that, and it is an excellent job, and one of the things I do, though, is to work with the Baker Institute. Here is Jim Baker. Here is Jim Baker, who was former Secretary of State and Secretary of Treasury in the Bush 41 administration. He is sort of honorary director, and he spends a lot of time at the Institute and has a lot of good ideas. Here's Edward Durigian. Edward Durigian is former ambassador to Syria and to Israel under two different administrations. And we work on a lot of different issues, which I won't put up again, but it includes space policy, among other things. And my good colleague, George Abbey, is here, and George teaches me a lot about space policy, and we have a great opportunity to do things together. So that's been a wonderful experience, and that's a lot about what I'm doing these days at Rice University. So the title of my talk is on that slide, and you saw it, but I've forgotten what it is, so I need to see. On life support, the future of science. So I mean life support in two different ways. I mean life support because half of all the federal money that goes to support research goes for life sciences. And life sciences, by definition, really is biomedical research. It's NIH. So think about that. Half of all the federal money that is spent in supporting research goes to the life sciences. So fair to say life support. And that has connected with it some policy implications. The other thing about life support really is that I think there's some problems. I think research, U.S. science and technology, and in particular the research base, has a questionable future, I would say, and I'll try to believe that. Then I'll talk about something called the gathering storm, and I'll tell you why I use that term, and I'll talk about it in a flattening world. In the flattening world, I'm really using the language of Tom Friedman in his book, The World is Flat, in which he talks about globalization, particularly the impact of science and technology, information technology on business and commerce. And then I'll talk about the future, but I have a big question mark because you're going to know as well as I do, maybe better, what the future holds for all of us. So we'll just sort of have a conversation about that. So let me see if I can get through this. So we're going to start with the golden age of science. I'll start it with the end of World War II. Science in the United States, at least as far as the federal government was concerned, and that would be an area of science policy then, was really about agriculture, and most research was being funded by private sources, industry, and individuals, until World War II. And in World War II, the government discovered probably for the first time, the power of science, engineering, technology, mathematics, in helping win the war. And the icon for that probably is the atom bomb. It's not a very good icon for one to have, I think, but the reality is that that's how many people think about science, in particular physics, when you go back to the end of World War II. But a lot of other things came out of World War II, not just the things I have up here, the radar and proximity fuse and analog computing and ballistic missiles, actually. We weren't doing so well until after the war, so we had to get a little help from our former enemies. So we learned in World War II that science could have a tremendous impact on important things that the country should care about. As a result of that, this man, Vannevar Bush, one of my predecessors, you might say, he was an advisor to Presidents Roosevelt and then Truman after Roosevelt's death. So all during the war, this is the guy who controlled the money, the priorities, pretty much everything having to do with research and development on with military goals. But as the war drew to a close, he, former MIT engineer, felt that the United States government, federal government, needed to continue to provide funding for research, that what was important in wartime would also be important in peacetime to the future of the United States. So he wrote this famous report, at least famous for those who worry about these things, Science, the Endless Frontier. And that report really established what many call the government-university partnership. What Vannevar Bush said is the federal government needs to accept these new responsibilities, and those would include new science development and new scientific knowledge and scientific talent in our youth. So he's really focusing on the federal government taking taxpayer money and using it to support universities through their research activities of their faculty and their students. And that began something that we have tended to call the compact, a new compact between science, which in this context really means the research carried out primarily in universities, and the public, faculty and students who do the research. And the public pays for it with their tax dollars through these agencies and other federal agencies that aren't here. The thing we forgot through the years, or some of us forgot, is that the science that we were talking about and that we agreed with the public we were going to fund was supposed to be research that was of value to society. And we weren't as good articulating that value over a long period of time as I think we probably should have been. It's a little bit of a lesson for the future, because now I think this compact's in some question. One way to think about this period is to, this thing I'm calling the Golden Age, is to try to define it in terms of years. So here's a picture of all the money. Money isn't everything, but it's a lot. So if you follow the money, you get some idea of where the priorities were of the United States with regard to research and development. So here's the money. Here's all the money that the United States was spending, federal money, not private money, federal money, as a function of time, between the end of the war and roughly current times. Well, there are a couple of things. I put the presidents in here so you can pick out your favorite president, or if there's one you're not so pleased with, you can find out where they are on this. You can see a few things. I marked Sputnik. We just celebrated the anniversary of the launching of Sputnik. Whatever one thinks about whether that was a good thing to happen or not, it certainly had an impact on science and on research and development in general. So here's a big bump. First thing that happened, this is Eisenhower time, first thing that happened was it bumped defense spending dramatically. And it once President Kennedy said in the Rice Stadium, he had said it previously, but we attribute it to Rice University. He said in the Rice Stadium, we'll send a man to the moon and back in a decade. We'll do it not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Haven't heard those words too much recently. I think that's a special kind of leadership, actually. So we had the Apollo program, extraordinary success by any measure, and you see a big bump in red numbers, which is non-defense spending, while after this military buildup had taken place. Again, these are R&D dollars, not total dollars for departments and so forth. So the Apollo program, nothing could be more exciting. It clearly launched the golden age of science in this country. It got many of us excited about science, and not just because it was fun and we love science, but because we knew it was important to the country. So we felt we were doing something important to America, not just entertaining ourselves with science. Also, the money flowed to educate many of us. The NDEA program and the federal agency programs of many kinds, they all got increased funding during that period. It was an extraordinary period. I also show on here the Reagan military buildup, and I put Star Wars that came and went, but we spent a lot of money on it, and it was actually the physicists who pointed out to the Reagan administration that that plan was fatally flawed and would not work. And that brought not a total end to the Star Wars program, but a redefinition, I guess, of what nuclear missile defense could be about. And then we had some flat period. We had some difficulties if you happen to care about defense funding, we had some times of flat funding through here into the Bush 41 and then the Clinton administration, in which we did see some increases in non-defense funding. And then President Bush, I marked 9/11 as really the end of the golden age, but that's around the time President Bush was assumed office as well. Why do I put the golden age in this period? It's because on the front end, I think it's clear that was Sputnik, and I think we could choose other markers, but I choose that as a marker. Vannevar Bush caused some buildup after the Second World War with his report, and that was very important. But it was Sputnik that really drove funding and, of course, the origins of the Apollo program and its success of the Apollo program. Then I stop at 9/11 with my golden age, mainly because of uncertainty. 9/11 was not only a horrible event, but a paradigm-changing one in many ways. And I'm just saying I don't think we know yet for sure what the implications are. But here's the Iraq War and a very significant defense buildup and the consequences of that. Now, if we look at what happened during this period, I only give a few examples. I think the investment of federal money in research and development was really well placed, and it had important results. So the things I have on this slide, the transistor up here, here's a picture of Jack Kilby, whom some of you may have known, who developed the integrated circuit. He knew it wasn't very pretty, but it was an extraordinary contribution, and of course that led to the whole chip world and semiconductor technology and so forth. Then the maser, Townsend, Shallow, and the laser, and I won't even attempt to describe the history of the laser. Many of you know it quite well, but it's too complicated for an aging policy type. It was an important development. These things, which are mainly physics-focused, and so many other things that discoveries that have been made, technological developments that have occurred through this period, I think point to enormous success of the Vannevar Bush idea and the federal investment in research and development in general. The other thing to say about this period, I think, is that it's not all federal government. So many of these things, as you know, came out of Bell Laboratories. But in some cases, they were partnering arrangements with universities, and we don't have a Bell Labs anymore. It was a special period in the history of U.S. science and technology. Another important technological development that came out of this period and developed during it, came out of the transistor and the integrated circuit and the development of the whole semiconductor technology, was, of course, computing and communications. And here's Moore's Law, which symbolizes all this. Here is Gordon Moore. When I talked to him, the late Gordon Moore, when I talked to him when President Clinton visited Caltech in 99 or 2000, Gordon Moore said he only expected his law, so-called law, to last maybe 10 years. He also said that he thought that this curve was to suggest that you would be able to double the number of transistors you put on a chip and therefore the capability of a computer every 2 years. He said, I don't know where people got 18 months from. It wasn't my idea. So Gordon Moore suggests 18 months is not his idea, but through some of this period, it's averaged about 18 months. He thought it would last a decade. It's still going. So now the question is, can it continue to go? Well, now we're talking about enough transistors and a small enough domain in which the electronics is being done that quantum effects are starting to appear and so forth. So some people feel that nanotechnology will have to come in at this point. At least it's maybe we'll get another order of magnitude, I understand, from people like Bill Joy who pay attention to these things. But then we got to do something else. Well, you sort of think about it. I mean, the impact of Moore's Law on our lives in almost every way, our automobiles, our communication systems, our telephones, our iPods, everything else, it's been riding on this curve. If this curve turns over, it's very hard to see quite how that's going to change the way we live and the way we make money and entertain ourselves and so forth. It would be a new world. So nobody really, that I know, wants to see this turn over. Other things that have come out of all this technological advancement are our iPod. Some of you have your iPods with you. I left mine at home because you can't listen to music, talk at the same time, so it's not polite. The example of this slide is to show some of the different ways that basic research, funded by the government, federal government, coming out of this Vannevar Bush model, in some ways owing its success to the Apollo program, I would argue, led to these kinds of products. And I won't go through them in detail because I think I don't know enough about it to go through them in detail. But it's just an example of the many, many ways in which this technological development through this period of the Golden Age has really impacted all of our lives. Now, here's the Golden Age again. So I'm defining the Golden Age between Sputnik and 9/11 for reasons that I've defined. And the question then is, what did we get done? Well, I've shown some of the outcomes of that, but I've also suggested earlier we're in life support. Namely, half of all the money we're spending on research provided by the federal government is supporting life sciences. So this shows this very explicitly. So here's non-defense R&D so that we can focus a little more on what's mainly research, not entirely, but this is mostly research now. So here's NASA, here's the Apollo program. As you know, NASA's had some ups and downs through its history, and very, very difficult periods. But what has not seemed to have changed much is the steady growth of NIH, biomedical research, from these early days, even in the days of the Apollo program. You could argue, well, as we were coming down off Apollo, we were putting some of that money in medical research, perhaps, but you can never really trace things like that in the way the federal budget gets put together. But that's the picture. So I title the slide From the Age of Space to the Age of Medicine, and a little bit I'll ask to the age of what. That's a little bit the question about the future. So science is literally on life support. So we're now we've grown funding of biomolecular research, biomedical research, and meantime we've held a lot of the other stuff flat. So chemistry, physics, non-medical biology, mathematics, computer science, engineering, they've had some ups and downs, but on the whole they haven't done terribly well. They're either flat or they're down. We see that in very clear ways if we're members of physics faculty and if we're involved in physics research or chemistry. If we think we got problems, talk to our chemistry colleagues and see how they're feeling about the health of chemistry in the United States. Well, maybe I'm biased. I'm a physicist. So I think this is a problem, policy question. Does it make sense for half of all the federal money to go for biomedical research? I'm not against that. I think very good things have come out of biomedical research. But at some point, if you don't fund the underlying tools and ideas and discoveries that actually are important to medical research and medicine, something's wrong. And Harold Varmus, former director of NIH, Nobel laureate himself, made this point clearly when he was director of NIH. You need the physics and the chemistry and the mathematics and the computer science and the engineering and all disciplines, and I would argue in the social sciences as well. You shouldn't just leave those stagnant because you don't quite understand why they connect. So I think we have a policy issue here to worry about. So that's sort of my golden age of science. Why do I define it that way? And is it over, or will it be extended, or will there be another golden age? I'd hear from you on that. But I'm troubled. And the reason I'm troubled, these are some of the reasons. There's a gathering storm, and I've used the words from the recent National Academy report on the health of science and technology in America. And that's related to this idea of a flattening world. So let's start with flattening world. Tom Friedman, columnist, author, wrote a book in which he said the world is flat. And his point was, I won't do it justice, so if he's in the audience, please excuse me. But here's the book. Interesting book. I've not tried to check all the facts in this book. It's quite richly resourced, actually, and so one can do a lot of that. But Friedman argues that there are 10 forces that are making other parts of the world, and I just pick out in particular China and India. They're large, and technical advancement is very fast, and economic growth is very fast, particularly in China. He says that these forces are making other parts of the world a more level playing field for commerce, trade, and other things. And so he immediately poses the question, well, maybe that's good for the world, but we should at least think about what the implications are for our future, the future of this country, our children, our grandchildren, and he poses those questions. Now, he says the real leveler here that makes the world a flatter place is information technology. So I talked about Moore's law. It's the things that drive computing and communication, and you'll see it in the forces. So here are his 10 forces that he calls them. Some are dates, some are developments that aren't so clearly time sequence. His first one is September 9, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. His point is, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it opened up large parts of the world to participate in ways they could not do before. On our continent, maybe Brazil. In Asia, China. And, of course, Russia itself. Former communist or nations that were particularly friendly to the USSR. So all that went away. You could argue that information technology actually was very significant in the collapse of the Soviet Union. And some people make that argument, that the Soviets knew they could not keep up, and as a result, and as a result of many other things, some of which accidental, the USSR fell apart. August 9, 1995, Netscape. That's really symbolic for the opening up of the web. The ability now to find information wherever it exists, wherever you can find it on the web. It could be anywhere in the world, and you can find it on your computer, I can find it on my computer. It opens the world's knowledge, and that knowledge is, of course, increasing. A lot of things on the web aren't knowledge, but they're all accessible. Okay. Workflow software. So that was just computer science developments, which our colleagues in computer science understand, and I don't claim to. But that allows you, from my computer to yours, I can send you music, video, audio, anything that we can put into bits can go between me and you. Open sourcing, Linux. So here's the idea that powerful software packages, in this case an operating system, can just be made available. I mean, you get all the code, and then you, in a democratic way, I guess I would describe it, we can use it for our own purposes. We can improve it. And you may have read about IBM's new, what is called cloud computing. It's their new idea for the company to sort of stay in the lead in high-performance computing. I read, can't confirm, that most of their software is going to be open source. It's extraordinary. It's kind of like the Wikipedia idea. I mean, the idea that we could have a democratic process that would converge on accurate information, and it's not always accurate in Wikipedia, but it's quite an extraordinary. It means something significant has changed about society and how people are going to interact and how we're going to learn and how we're going to accomplish things in the future. Outsourcing, India. Well, the Y2K problem was a boon for India. They had smart people in India willing to work on hard problems, and we had a bunch of companies who needed desperately people to look at their code and look at it very fast. Well, they needed COBOL programmers, for example. Well, don't come to me. COBOL was not something that I studied when I was a student. My wife helped me with all my programming, so she's a Fortran expert, but COBOL wasn't her first language either. We found very bright people in India who could hop on those problems and do them well. And it opened up, of course, a whole domain of business for India, and they've been doing quite well at it. Offshoring. Not only would we take jobs offshore, and we could all do that, we do all this electronically, we could do it over fiber optics cable. Not only would we take jobs offshore and get them done cheaper than we could anyplace else and fast, we'd send manufacturing facilities, maybe even R&D laboratories offshore, in this case to China, and in some cases to India. I should say about outsourcing, outsourcing in India has been so successful that I read recently India is now re-outsourcing back to Idaho. Well, who wins in that? I don't know, maybe everybody. It's a global community. We'll say more about China. Supply chaining, Walmart. That's just an example of a company that took advantage of information technology, the power of computing, to cut out the middleman, work directly with the manufacturers, thousands of them. So when you, as I understand it, when you check out a Walmart and you buy your, I know you don't shop at Walmart, but some people do, and when they take out this laser pointer and they check out and they scan it, immediately that information goes not just to headquarters in Arkansas, it goes all the way back to whoever makes the laser pointer. And they feed that into some algorithm and decide whether to make another one or make 10 or make 12 immediately. Extraordinary development. And Walmart's trying to be green. I hope they're green. I think they didn't treat their employees as well as they should, so they're not a perfect model, but an example of this particular case. Insourcing, UPS. UPS, turns out, is an end-of-runway service. It's not just a delivery service. They make pizza. They deliver and therefore make and deliver Papa John's pizza. They repair Canon copiers, I think that's right. They assemble Nikon cameras. They do all kinds of extraordinary things, and they do that by forming a partnership with the respective company that gets them embedded, as you can imagine, pretty deep into the company's secrets. Requires trust, probably of a kind that's relatively new. And everybody makes money as the process goes, and it cuts down amount, transporting goods back and forth, an inefficient process. Informing, that's Google. That's kind of access to the world's knowledge. I Google, you Google, everybody Googles, and often it's extraordinary what you get, and sometimes it's not so wonderful what you get, but it's just a stand-in, if you like, for our ability to find information fast. And I find with these sorts of things, if I know what I'm looking for, I can find it much faster here than I can even turning around and getting it out of a file. It's quite extraordinary, the advantages that it provides, and others who will follow in that footstep. Steroids, these are the things that drive all this. These are the things Friedman points to that are digital, virtual, mobile, and personal. There are cell phones, and there are iPods, and our pocket personal devices that keep us organized and so forth. This is what he says are the forces. He said they're changing the whole world, and they're changing the way in which the United States will have to work with the rest of the world. But he says we need to worry in this country because there are these three dirty little secrets that have to do with the U.S.'s ability to compete in this global world. And there are three of them. The first one is the numbers gap, and that's just the question with the baby boomers retiring, as they're starting to do and will certainly do within the decade. We don't see in the pipeline behind them the scientists, mathematicians, computer science, and engineers to fill their places. Where are we going to get those people? Secret number two, the ambition gap. This is a troublesome one. Many companies found that when they went abroad to get the job done, they got it done not only at lower cost, they got better performance. They got a higher quality product turned out because the people were more ambitious and in some cases better trained and educated. The education gap is part of the reason for problem number two. We have young people getting terrific education, and you see them, they come to your university. But on average, across the country, we do a lousy job of educating Americans. And the problem will become more severe as the demographics continue to shift. And Texas, California, the border states in particular, face serious challenges. So you put these together, the numbers gap, ambition gap, and education gap, and Friedman says we have a problem. Now, the Congress became very worried about this, and so two members of Congress, Republican Lamar Alexander and Democrat, who was the Democrat? Bingaman, went over to the National Academies and said, look, we recognize these things Friedman's talking about are serious problems for the country. Tell us 10 things we can do, 10 things that we can do to help the situation. So the Academy formed a committee, that's what they do, and they had the extraordinary good fortune of recruiting this guy, Norman Augustine, to chair this committee. Norman is a Republican, but he served on Clinton's Science and Technology Advisory Committee. He serves on President G.W. Bush's advisory committee. He's very highly regarded by all people in the Congress. He's a former CEO of Lockheed Martin Marietta originally, and then Lockheed Martin. He took this job on, and his committee, a bipartisan committee, very diverse committee, included several Texans, in fact. That's got to be diverse, if you got several Texans on your committee. And they wrote this report called Rising Above the Gathering Storm. It's about inch thick. It's very specific, rich with data, and provides specific recommendations on what to do. They're very responsive. They did it quickly, and it's had enormous impact, and I'll describe the impact. I just mentioned Norman more recently wrote his own take on all of this issue in something the Academy published called Is America Falling Off the Flat Earth? And so if you're interested in these, you can find them on the National Academy web if you hunt. I do not find the National Academy's website all that friendly, let me tell you. But if you have any trouble, write me, Neal at rice.edu, and I'll be glad to share my experiences with you, and we can track these things down. Okay, I don't have time for all the recommendations of the Gathering Storm report, but since it had a huge impact, I think I should tell you what areas it covered. It talked about an area they called 10,000 teachers, 10 million minds. So that was a number of recommendations, specific recommendations to enhance K-12 education. So let me be clear. My words here are not anything like the report. Everybody can say enhance K-12 education. They said explicitly where they recommended the federal government take steps, make investments, change policies to make that happen. Similarly, sowing the seeds, they called it, grow basic research, and do a lot of other things that will cost money, of course, but in their view was very important to ensuring that there was a research base that was of the right construct to support the future needs of the country. Best and brightest. For example, science and engineering undergrad scholarships. Make sure that there's plenty of funding there to support young people who want to work in science and engineering. Part of our problem in the last decade or so is not enough young people want to do that for a lot of different reasons. So let's find a way to ensure that those who are attracted to those careers can, in fact, afford to go to school. And there are many other recommendations. Finally, incentives for innovation, well, the research and experimentation tax credit's an example. Federal government, every so often, updates the law that says that companies that increase the amount of money they spend on research and development by some definition can be taken off their tax. So there are a lot of problems with the law in its current form, and the recommendations here are to change that law so that it's more effective. Congressional action is something called the America Competes Act. There were many bills that moved around the Congress to respond to this report, and the one that actually made it all the way through, signed by the President into law, was the America Competes Act. It does a number of these things and also does additional things that members of Congress felt were very important. It's a good law. It doesn't deliver the money. It's what we call an authorization bill. It's a statement of intent of the Congress. It's better to have it than not have it, but now it's got to get translated into the appropriation that the federal government has to do every year through the agreement of the President and the Congress. And as you know, that's not going so well right now. But we hope over time these things will be put in place. I mentioned the President was for it. I'm sorry, I don't intend for you to look at all this. This is funding for DOE's Office of Science, Department of Energy's Office of Science, and the National Science Foundation, and a little agency called the National Institute for Standards and Technology. And those are things the President thinks are particularly important, and he's recommending significant increases in funding. Quite a positive response the President Bush made to this report. And this is the projected funding. You can't read the letters, but from now on to the year 2012. So essentially doubling the funding over 10 years. So I guess that's 2016, actually. You'll find this is his language, the American Competitiveness Initiative. That's what the President called his approach to this. And in there you'll find buzzwords like innovation, competitiveness, and energy independence. So this is what the President wants to do, and then I just mentioned what the Congress wants to do. And since the President signed the Congress bill, I think that means that they're going to come together and that some of the things that the Gathering Storm report recommends will actually happen. Now, part of the problem is that while the President did increase funding for some of these agencies, like the National Science Foundation and Department of Energy, and some defense funding, and NASA, but not for NASA science, rather for the President's exploration program, which I'll talk about in a minute. He also cut the dickens out of all the rest of the federal investment in research and development. The Congress has tried to restore some of these things, and therein lies some of the difficulty in getting agreement with the president. So the trouble is when a president does this sort of thing, boosts part of government and cuts the dickens out of another part of government, you know you're in for a fight with the Congress. So it's not over yet, but I wanted to make the point. The president agrees with many of the points made in that report I talked about, and the Congress does as well. They just have a somewhat different view about how to get there. Now, one thing, though, that is a little bit puzzling is that neither the president nor Congress is all that excited about the life sciences anymore. So after this doubling period, where NIH budget doubled over a period of 7 years here, NIH has been in real trouble since then. They were flat funded a couple of years and then have started to come down. Well, during this time, the biomedical research community was building. They were building buildings, they were hiring young people, they were expanding their laboratories. So there they all are, and now the money stopped. It didn't stop, of course, but the growth stopped. And so I would argue in defense of NIH, it's not easy for anybody to manage a budget curve like this, and I wouldn't have anticipated a budget curve that looked like this. But they're in trouble. Medical research is in trouble, medical schools are in trouble, and NIH is in trouble. And the reason, I think, is that it's widely perceived, right or wrong, that NIH mismanaged the budget doubling. Senior researchers got the money. The average age for the first competitive grant, no reason you would know what R01 is, but it's what NIH calls the first competitive grant, regular real research grant for an independent investigator. Average age is 42 years old. Well, I was getting ready to retire at 42 years old. Also, the success rate for those grants dropped sharply from 50% to 20%, that being the 2006 figure. There was a large influx of young people coming in, being hired on postdocs, and many coming into graduate school. It looked really good in the early days of that doubling. It doesn't look so good right now. They're trapped. There are few tenure-track opportunities unless the retirements pick up for some reason. Morale is not good. We could waste, I think, a generation of talent. It's a real example of the federal government's inability to plan and carry out any kind of reasonable policy. Not always the case, but it is the case here. Meanwhile, maybe NSF, National Science Foundation, one of my favorite agencies, will grow. Here's history of their budgets. The NSF total budget includes education. That's why the total budget is higher than what's called the R&D budget. Sorry, the blue line is NSF's research and development. That's mainly research. The red is the total NSF budget. The difference is primarily education programs. NSF funds a lot of science, engineering, math, education. We had trouble with Gingrich, okay? You remember him. But after we the President and Newt Gingrich agreed to work together, we were able to get some reasonable budgets. And so NSF budget started to increase through the Clinton administration and continued into the early Bush administration, but then NSF has also had trouble with the Bush administration. I showed you President Bush's plans for the future, and they are to now increase NSF in the future, and I think that might happen. But it's very difficult to think that that's really sustainable over the long haul in such a difficult budget environment. Finally, the future. Sorry about taking all this time. What about the future? Well, I don't know, of course, but here are some policy issues that I would say are in disarray. I thought about what word to use. To polite. I want to be reasonably polite to this audience and be welcome back someday maybe. So I choose the word disarray as opposed to 2 or 3 words that came to mind. Okay. Energy and the environment. I think it's in disarray, and I won't try to say why because you know these things as well as perhaps better than I do. The nation doesn't really have a sensible energy policy, and as you know, at least the current administration is not in favor of a climate change policy that really would have teeth in it, that would regulate carbon emissions. You may have seen in today's paper, the last of the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out. And that's called the synthesis report. That's where the climate scientists, including government people, look at all the previous reports, sort of all the science that anybody knows about climate change that's been published peer-reviewed, it's in the literature, and then they draw their best conclusions about the impact. Well, there's no good news there. There's nothing, even though the U.S. pushed back some of the stronger language, even the weaker language is bad news. It's extremely frightening to me, and I must say I'm more concerned about this than I was when I was in the White House working with Clinton and Gore. Gore, of course, has believed this for a very long time, even before the science was clear. Science has gone his way. I don't think he was responsible for it. Maybe he's lucky, but in any case, the people most worried, you know, when you think that maybe science is not giving you the right answer, often you find on these issues that the people the non-experts are more worried about something than the experts. So it's not always the case, but it often is. So when you get the experts in the room and talk to them, they say, well, wait a minute. I know that it's an emotional issue and so forth, like a virus leaking out of our laboratory. We make an artificial virus, and boy, that sounds scary to me. And there are movies and books, but you get people together who know about that, and they say, you know, the chance of something like that surviving in a Darwinian world is very small. And so what's different about climate change is when you bring the experts in the room, they're terrified. I mean, the public at large is concerned, increasingly worried, but the experts, I know, are terrified of the implications of climate change. And it's not a conspiracy, and they don't get money for saying so. They just know what the science is. Also, there are uncertainties in the science. So, yeah, they're terrified, but can they prove that their worst-case scenarios will come true? Well, I don't know, but I can tell you the worst-case scenarios for the IPCC report, this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a UN body of scientists, the worst-case scenario looks like it's already come true earlier than we thought before. We're putting more carbon in the atmosphere now. We're putting the maximum amount of carbon in the atmosphere that the IPCC thought was possible. It has to do with economic development and going faster than people think. So there's a chance that the average temperature of the Earth will go up in the century by 6 degrees, not 3. 6 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, 6 degrees Fahrenheit, there's little question about what you're going to melt the Greenland ice sheet. Not in a day, but it's an event you'd have to plan for over a century or so. It's a very scary situation. I'll be quicker on the next one. Biomedical research, I just pick out NIH's problems, which I've talked about, and stem cell research. There are a lot of issues, but stem cells is something where it's an example of when the federal government goes against the public will. Very clear, if you look at the polls, people want to see stem cell research done. But the president is concerned about embryonic stem cell research, and so he does not allow the creation of any new stem cell lines using federal money. That's created a huge policy mess, I would say. States now have their own laws. There's no national guideline that binds them. So some states put $3 billion into stem cell research, like California. Other states make it a criminal act to engage in stem cell research. It's a mess. Not only that, but in a place like the Health Science Center in Houston, where some private funding's been raised for stem cell research, researchers got to be really careful when he or she goes from their NIH laboratory over to the private laboratory not to carry the computer, because maybe that was bought on NIH money, and if that same computer goes into the lab working on stem cells, somehow federal money is being used to support stem cell research. Perhaps I've overstretched the situation, but I know very similar situations that make it very, very difficult. So it's wasteful of money, and it happens, I think, when a president goes against the views of the larger majority. There is a moral imperative here, in my view, and it's to take a more progressive position on this. We have run 3 studies and workshops and conferences on stem cell research, and recently the state of Qatar has endowed our stem cell research program because they see their future not in oil, but in science and technology and information. And they want us to help them see how this policy should be put together. Finally, space science and exploration. George Abbey is here, I mentioned, and George and I wrote a paper published by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences a few years back. And in that paper, we were rather critical of the current position, and the reason was, I can state it very simply, after the president came out of his exploration initiative, my comment and testimony was that the president's initiative is bold. I believe it is bold. to go back to the moon and perhaps onto Mars. And I happen to be sort of a space cadet, so I don't mind saying bold, but I said it's incomplete. And it's incomplete because science is not one of the priorities of the President's initiative. And if you don't name it, it's going to lose. If it isn't a priority, then it's not important. And so over time, the money is going to be eroded from science. And you know how important, what extraordinary success NASA's science programs have been, the planetary missions and the astronomy. So we talked about that. I also said, and we said in our article, because George agreed, the plan is incomplete because it's not funded. Nobody knows what it's going to cost. Nobody tried to figure that out before it was announced. The President gave a speech, and here we go. It's going to cost an enormous amount of money, I believe. But we have experts in the room who will know that. But that's what we said many years ago, and we thought there was a problem phasing the space shuttle out as quickly as the President said to do so, that we would find many years, we would have a long period in which U.S. had no access to space, human access to space at all, except on a Russian rocket. And that will be, of course, the situation for a number of years, that just be longer years than we might have liked. So we're in favor of space exploration as well as space science, and we believe the current plan doesn't get us there. So that's what I think about three policy issues. But let me talk about some barriers that I think we face. So what about the future? Here are 6 barriers. The first 2, I think the Gathering Storm report dealt with, and there's already been legislation, and we see some progress. Money for science, too little planning, I'll say. Maybe it's too little money, but it's certainly not the right set of priorities. People in science, too few, that's the education, workforce issue, and so forth. And I should say what I didn't say earlier, but I want to make sure I do. The only way we've been able to have a strong science and technology program in the United States, given our lack of ability to attract young people to the field, is because people came here, bright young men and women born all over the world, came to America to study and in many cases to establish their careers here. Some went back, but many stayed. Boy, that's a net plus of a very large magnitude. Now there are opportunities for young Chinese people in China and young Indian people in India and other parts of the world. And it's not so clear that all these people are going to come to the United States for their education. I could see a situation in a decade or so where we're sending the best of our students to China because they've got the modern facilities, they've got the laboratories, and maybe even they have many of the smart people to do the research. That'd be a very different situation. Not that I predict that, but it's not out of the question that we could end up in that sort of situation. Now, here are things the Gathering Storm didn't deal with. Understanding of science, I would say, too little. I mean, public understanding. Ideology, too much. Politics, too intrusive. And public confidence, I would at least ask the question, is it fragile? So what about the money, though, for just a minute? Here's a way to think about the money. Here's all the money the federal government spends in a year. We'll put it on a pie. $2.8 trillion in fiscal year 2007. It's a sizable amount of money. Doesn't include the war in Afghanistan and Iraq because the president won't put that in the budget. But it's everything else. All right. All the things with X's, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, those are mandatory expenses, non-discretionary. You have other laws binding what you spend. Some of them are indexed to what happens in the economy and how many people you're having to retire and so forth. You could change the laws, but as you know, that's kind of hard to change the Social Security law. I don't see these getting smaller. In fact, there's a lot of worry about what's going to happen to Medicare, for example. I see them getting larger, if anything. Here's the interest on the national debt. Well, that little slice of the pie has actually grown quite a lot since this graph was drawn. The national debt now is over $9 trillion, and so we're going to pay a sizable amount of money on that. And also, that debt is increasingly owned by China and Japan and other parts of the world. They buy as much as they're legally allowed to buy. At least they were at one point. So this is not good. I mean, well, it's good that they're investing in the United States. That means we're a good investment. Our bond rating is high. But it won't be if we don't keep paying the interest on the national debt. So we got to pay that. We have to pay all that. So 1/3 of the federal budget is discretionary, and half of that is defense, and the other half non-defense. And as you know, for the current fiscal year, the year we're in right now, The Congress has only been able to get the President to sign a bill on the defense part. They have not been able to agree on the non-defense. These slices are R&D. Let's look at the non-defense research and development. That's this slice. That's where most of the research really is that I've been talking about. It's small. I see the X's expanding. I think there's going to come a point where the United States citizens are going to say, we do not want to spend any more money, in which case this pie is going to shrink. Defense, I don't see getting less. I think defense is going to at least maintain the fraction that it's in. I believe we're going to get squeezed, and research is going to get squeezed. Well, can you prove that, Neal? Well, no, but we can look at history. Here are two graphs. They're scaled. The black one is non-defense discretionary, and here's the scale. So this is the total amount of non-defense money that is discretionary, that the appropriations process deals with. Okay, over time it goes up. It's in constant dollars, all right? So it shows there's been growth in overall spending. It's had its ups and downs and so forth. And now it's about, short of $500 billion, okay? The red curve is the rightmost scale. That's non-defense research and development. And that's where NIH is, NASA, National Science Foundation, and so forth. It's now 55 or so $billion. But look how those curves have tracked. The only real dramatic exception was the Apollo time. In the time of Apollo, we were spending a lot more money on non-defense research and development to get to the moon and back than we've ever done since then as a fraction of the total budget. I think it was money well spent, but the question is, will there be another Apollo program for anything? Energy, health, whatever. So this black curve going down are projections of what's going to come. So everybody's predicting the budget is going to go down. And I would say, if the total discretionary budget goes down, so will science, because that's what history has done since the Apollo program. That's why I'm so worried about it. Understanding of science too little. Here are the numbers. I'm sorry. Let me take the second one, which has to do with numbers. Young people, where are they going to come from? So here are a couple of points. U.S. universities graduate about 20,000 PhDs a year. 30% are born outside the U.S., the point I made earlier. Thank God that they came, that you came, because that's been important for our economic health of our economy. But the numbers have been falling for several years. They've recovered a bit, but I'm just not sure how it's going to be in the future. This shows the total number of PhDs in natural science and engineering, and you can't see it, I apologize, but this China flag means that China's been going up steeply. China is investing enormous amounts of money in building up their universities, their graduate programs. Many of their students are going to stay and do their graduate work in China and do the research there. So a concern is that too few U.S. boys and girls seek careers in science and engineering, mathematics, technology of all kinds. But concern number two is that increasingly students from abroad have opportunities in their own countries. And I just remind you that in some fields, the fraction of foreign-born men and women is 40, 50, 60%. And you know those fields quite well. Now, understanding of science too little. What do people know about science? Well, here's the National Science Board results of a few years ago. Plants produce oxygen, 70% of the people. Continents have been moving for millions of years. That's interesting because half the American people believe in the literal interpretation of the Bible, which I think is a little short on the moving of continents for millions of years. As our light travels faster than the sun, Earth goes around the sun. But if you ask people how long does it take the Earth to go around the sun, you lose 20% of the American people. Because only half of the American people know that it takes a year. I don't know how long other people think it might take, but that's it. And that's the same fraction of people that believe earliest humans lived with dinosaurs. So we have a problem. People don't know a lot about science. Ideology too much. People do believe things, though. So ghosts and haunted houses, so forth. They're pretty big numbers. Astrology is sort of scientific, 40%. 60% of the people believe teach creationism in the science classes. Maybe with evolution, give the kids a choice, or maybe without. And I have Pandas and People. This was a kind of famous book that was published as an alternative to the biology text. This is the intelligent design interpretation of panda bears, I guess, and everything else. Politics too intrusive. Well, this is a little political, but several years ago, several of us got so concerned about what was happening in the administration in its what we called abuse of science that we spoke out. We signed a statement. That's the only statement of that kind I've ever signed about any administration, any politician. What was happening was that government agencies and the White House putting out incorrect scientific information about climate and a whole lot of other things. Two things need to be said. The fact that the administration had policies that I didn't agree with that's life. I mean, we're a democracy, we're a political system. Some presidents I'm going to like and some presidents I'm not going to like, perhaps. This is a different matter. This is the federal government saying things that are incorrect about the science. And we said that's a problem, that we should not let that happen. The point is scientific knowledge is not simply a matter of opinion. And if we have a public that doesn't understand science very well, and if they decide that anybody can just manipulate science for their own end, then it's a problem. Public confidence in science is fragile as a result of these. I think it's a question. Public confidence in science is pretty high. It's been pretty high and invariant over a long period of time. I don't see it changing particularly. It's worth keeping in mind, though, I think, as we decide how we spend our time. So where's science going? From the age of space to the age of medicine, more medicine, security, maybe after 9/11, I thought for a while. Energy and environment, serious issues. Space would be exciting again. Competitiveness, we hear that as a buzzword. Knowledge, wouldn't it be great to be living in the age of knowledge? But for a while it looked like we were going to be living in the age of ignorance. Where's science going? Where do we want it to go? Where do we think it ought to go? And how can we help it get there? We're going to need more civic scientists. And by civic scientists, I'm talking about scientists who not only did their work in their lab and their office and they made the important discoveries and maybe educated students if they're on the universities. They did what they expected to do. But who also then took time out, maybe time out of their careers, to get out of the laboratory, to interact with the public in many different ways, in education, but also in public policy, those people elected to office. And I just give 3 examples to tell you what I'm thinking about. Benjamin Franklin, he was an amateur scientist, but he was an awfully good one. He wrote beautifully, did wonderful experiments on electricity, and wrote beautifully about them, and then took time out to try to repair our relationship with England, which wasn't successful, and then joined the revolutionaries to break away from England. Rick Smalley, and so Franklin used not only his knowledge, but his fame that he derived from science, because he showed that lightning, in fact, was a natural phenomenon. I mean, especially the French were taken with his work, and he was a famous man when he got to France, but the reason he was in France was to get the money to help us fight the English. Well, France kind of was comfortable, sort of comfortable doing that anyway, but he was very effective through his fame. Late Rick Smalley, extraordinary scientist, great chemist, Nobel laureate, who co-discovered carbon-60 and all of Fuller in chemistry that came out of it with Robert Curl, who's at Rice, and Harry Kroto of the United Kingdom. He took the last part of his life to talk about energy, the problems of getting enough carbon-free energy, I think he would say carbon-free energy, to satisfy the world's demands. Otherwise, all kinds of bad things happen, and we sadly lost him in 2005. And then I put up Shirley Jackson. Shirley Jackson's an extraordinary person. She was just on the Rice campus at the Baker Institute delivering what we call the Civic Science Lecture. Shirley Jackson is a physicist, great physicist. She started out in theoretical elementary particle physics, and then she shifted to theoretical condensed matter physics, solid state, optical sciences, had a career at Bell Labs. Then she became chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is where I worked with her, in Washington, when I was in the White House, and then is now president of Rensselaer Polytech Institute. She's the first African-American woman to get a PhD from MIT in any field at all. And she's one of the early African Americans to get a PhD in physics, period. These are examples of civic scientists. We need a lot more. There are many in this room. There are hundreds, thousands around the country. But I think it's something maybe we haven't paid as much attention to in the past as we do in the future. I think we're going to need to do this because the public is going to need to be more a part of the process. It can't be us and them. We're going to have to figure out how to help the public understand the importance of science technology, what it means to their lives, how valuable it really is. And then we need to listen. We need to hear what people think about science, what their concerns are, what their worries are, what do they want to see us invest in. I'm short of a town meeting and a vote that determines our research priorities, I guess, but a little more movement in that direction, I think, is what America's all about, and that's not what we've done in the past. So, science on life support. So why are my grandkids smiling? Well, it's because I'm their granddad. You know. But maybe it's more than that. My point of this is that the reason I have to be optimistic about all these issues I've been talking about is the people that you see and the people that come to my campus, young people who are coming in who are so much smarter than I was when I was their age, who are much more familiar with the technology and know where to find the information. It's second nature to them all. They're much more comfortable working with people of different colors and different backgrounds and from different parts of the world. It's much more natural to them than it was for me. They also know that in the future, the United States will be a leader by being a partner with other countries of the world, that the days of U.S. goes it alone are over. And they'll know how to do that. So I think we've handed them some extraordinary problems to deal with. I wish we'd left them a better legacy than we have, but we have left them with, in many cases, with the opportunity for education and with the science and technology that has been developed through this wonderful golden age. And so maybe they'll help us have another golden age in the future. Thank you very much.
If you have questions for Dr. Lane, there are two microphones in front. There's one on each side near the entrances, so just please come down and...
I'm sorry, it's a long walk.
Larry Rohde. I teach,
Hello.
I'm an associate professor of biology here at the University of Houston, Clear Lake. I like the idea of the civic scientists, but I kind of want to put forward another point that maybe we need to go further down than that. And the reason I do that is because here at the university we teach, the professors are teaching to their students in the classroom. They don't have a whole bunch of TAs, so they have direct contact with them. And the reason I bring this up is that one of my students who was at the main campus, University of Houston, pointed out something to me, the reason why she came here. And the fact was that when she went to talk to one of the professors there, he told her basically because she was a Hispanic female, she might want to pursue some other career. Now, she came here and she's now doing a work at a biotech company down in Galveston. She got a good training here. And the reason I bring this up is I think that there needs to be a change at the larger campuses, UT, Texas A&M, University of Houston. If we want science to be taught to the overall population, then we need to have professors who are working at the general biology, general chemistry, and all that, and having a little more direct contact with those people, because not a lot of those people are going to go into science, but we might give them a better education. I was wondering if what did you think about that?
I really appreciate the question. I can tell you if Shirley Jackson were here, she would have a lot to say about this issue. It is, of course, awful to hear nowadays about some member of our faculty saying such a thing to a young person. It's extremely discouraging because most young people, included me, but I can imagine if you're coming out of a community where there aren't many role models, and maybe your parents didn't have the advantages of college education, and maybe there weren't a lot of encouragements, and if you're coming out of there and you get discouraged at a critical stage in your education development, we could lose a person. In this case, not, but we could lose a person in that situation. And I think that example shows that the reason we've not made more progress in attracting to our field more women and members of underrepresented communities is because the support structure really isn't there. And sometimes it's support just in the terms of encouragement. You know, you can do anything you want to. I mean, this is America. I mean, what happened to that idea that in this country, everybody has an opportunity? You can do anything you want to. Where did that go? I'd like to believe that such faculty are the exception. They're on every campus, I believe. I think the situation you described is everywhere. We're going to have to reverse that. I believe it's not going to really happen until we get very serious about representation on our own faculties. I'm from Rice University. I can tell you we have a very poor record. We have many more women on our teaching faculty and tenured faculty than we did 20 years ago. But our record in terms of African Americans and Latinos is very poor. And you could have Richard Tapia, whom some of you know here, to talk about this issue. He's very critical of Rice and many other institutions. It's a serious issue, and we have not figured out how to cope with it. We need role models. And those of us who aren't perhaps very good role models for a young woman from an underrepresented community can at least be sensitive about the importance of encouraging each young person to do what they can to realize their potential. So I think it's a serious issue, and I believe it's one that we will only deal with on our campuses. You know, you can have a lot of federal programs, and there are a lot of them, and they do good in various areas. But this is an issue for each of us in our own departments to sit down and think, how serious is this matter? Is this serious enough to have a chat with our president, who we know understands these issues and cares about them on every campus, and try harder, figure out a better way of working, because the clock has run out. We don't have any time left to say, gee, well, maybe we're not going to be successful in another 20 years. Let me tell you, if we don't solve this problem in 20 years, we're out of it. We are out of business, not just in science technology, but as a leading nation in the world, period. Now, that's not what we want our kids, our grandkids, to face. But I think the situation is so serious, and there's not much time left to deal with it. Okay, Neal, what are your ideas? What are your programs? It's hard. But I think that that we need to see it. I'm hoping that in Washington we'll have a leadership that will do what the federal government can do and knows how to do well. And then on the campuses, we need a leadership to help us understand how to address this right at the ground roots. But we're just going to have to take some chances. We're going to have to bring some faculty into our departments and on our campuses who want to come, and many of whom will be terrific, and then figure out how to make progress. I think we could make progress pretty fast in a decade. Smart kids are there. I mean, they're everywhere. They're in every community. They're in the poor parts of the cities. They're in the rural areas. They're disadvantaged in many cases because of the schooling and the many abuses they've been subjected to, but they're there. If we can find them and get them into our universities and give them the kind of mentoring and education they deserve, then I think we can solve this problem. But we don't have, maybe we have a decade, we don't have two. Now, you could argue, well, the rest of the world's going to blow up. Well, if the rest of the world blows up, okay. Then, yeah, okay. But if things continue, peaceful world, economic development going like it's going, then I'm afraid we face the problems that Tom Friedman talked about, because he's aware of all these kinds of issues. I appreciate your point.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Handy. I'm the chair of physics at Texas Southern University. I wasn't going to say anything, but the previous gentleman kind of broke the ice. I have, everybody talks about role models, but my belief is that the importance of role models is not for the minority person, it's for the majority population in convincing them that a minority can do it. Because for me to need a role model to do physics is to suggest that somehow I need a psychiatric, support to continue, and it lies within one. I rejoiced when the Iron Curtain fell down, because I said, great, now all the capitalistic, vices will infect the young population of those countries, and they won't be coming here. And the reason for that is, American scientists, especially in the elite schools, are lazy. They don't want to work hard or to mentor our own to really reach the kind of capability that you would require for them to be successful. It's like you want the easy thing, so gee, it's great that we keep that pipeline from overseas coming because we don't want to spend the time on our own. My real question to you is, who are the scientific advisors advising Bush? And how do they relate to the rest of the scientific population or community that apparently has a more responsible attitude towards what's happening? You have said nothing about who's advising Bush and what kind of influence people like you have on them.
Well, I appreciate the question, and I certainly agree with the point you're making. Maybe we could agree that it's both, that the role model is important in both ways that you describe. I think that you see there are a lot of good people, good white Anglo men and women in departments all around who've got strange ideas about about who can do what. And nothing makes as much difference as having someone come into their department who comes from an unlikely community and is successful, works hard, shows that he or she can compete as a faculty member, as a faculty colleague. That's very influential on a whole lot of people because in many cases, many of our departments, there wasn't a single hire made like that. So I think it can influence them, can influence our faculty colleagues as well. The science advisor, President Bush's science advisor is a man named John Marburger. He's a physicist. He's a laser scientist, actually. He was president of Stony Brook for, I think, over a decade. He was director of the Brookhaven National Laboratories, very highly regarded person. I talk with him from time to time. I cannot tell you what influence I have over him because sometimes we're on a radio show where we're on opposite ends of the spectrum, but we've had a good relationship. I believe he is getting the very best advice to President Bush that he can. I think he understands these issues and that he's doing that. But you see, in the case of the science advisor, if the science advisor is really influential, that must be invisible to the outside world. I mean, the science advisor is a confidential advisor to the president. So the science advisor can't go out and say, I just recommend the president do A. That's not what the job's all about. Science advisors should be relatively invisible as far as advice he or she is giving to the president. So when when the new president's science advisor new president, is this being videotaped? I think when the new president comes into office, or before he or she gets into office, that individual will have selected a very good person as science advisor. There's been a tradition of present company accepted, but very good people in that office. They've mostly been physicists for reasons that we could debate. They don't need to be physicists, particularly in today's age of science. But I include Jack Marburger in that group. What I do believe is that this administration has been less receptive of really sound advice in many areas than at least the administration I worked in. So I think it's been a tough job for President Bush's science advisor, but he has done his job, I believe, as well as anybody could do under those circumstances, and I have never criticized him, his performance, and don't expect to. But your question goes deeper in areas I don't know. I can't really know then what's going on inside today's White House, because believe it or not, I'm rarely inside today's White House. Thank you for the question.
All right, thank you.
Hello, my name is Marlo Graves, and I'm a master's student in physics at UHCL. This summer, I was fortunate enough to spend 3 months in Beijing, China, as a part of a job that I was working.
Great. And
I was on Beihang University, and what you said is correct. The universities there are huge. This was one university just dedicated to aeronautical engineering, so China really is growing. My question to you is, do you see more colleges encouraging students to do some sort of exchange program? And also, what about encouraging students to study language so that we can have more of a back and forth dialogue? English is kind of the default language for business and such, but it definitely makes a difference if you can converse with people in their own language. So do you see universities like Rice and UHCL doing things like that to encourage partnership?
Thank you, Marlo. I appreciate the question. I do believe that foreign exchanges are increasingly important. I recommended at Rice on various committees that Rice require time abroad. And that's complicated, especially in engineering curricula. It has all kinds of implications, mismatches of schedules in different parts of the world. But I believe it's sufficiently important that all of our young people should do that. And then I think they should study the language. If it happens to be a country with a foreign language, they should study that language at some level of proficiency. If they want to go to England, that's fine, but I still think they need to study a foreign language. Whether to the extent to which that is part of the curriculum and is another question, which is complicated, and whether they ought to receive the same kind of credit for language study as other among faculty, and I don't have a good answer to that, but I think the issues are very important. China is, I appreciated your comment on what's going on in China. The other thing to say about China, though, is they don't have a history of and a culture of having a system of higher education like we have. So they're starting almost from scratch. As you know, the Chinese Academy of Sciences was very much modeled after the Soviet Academy, which is a hierarchy of very smart people, but they had little interactions with the universities, and the money went there. It was politically influenced, and the idea of peer review, merit review, is almost not entirely foreign, but largely foreign to them. So they have a whole apparatus to put together quickly if they want to see the success to come out of the investments that they're making that we have seen. And I think we need to work with them to do that. They're reaching out. They're anxious to see that happen. But it won't, I guess I'm just saying, just by them building the universities and the laboratories, which I emphasized earlier, that's not enough. You really have to have a system that's taken us decades to build. And so there's still questions about how rapidly and how effectively they'll be able to make use of that investment. Yes, more foreign exchange, more language.
Hello, I'm Camille Paris, psychology faculty here at U of H Clear Lake. While I certainly agree with and see the merit in this contract between higher education and training and the federal government, it seems to me we're currently, and I think your graphs displayed very well, that the federal government's ability to fund the building of science and the teaching of science, I think it's becoming more and more limited, regardless of what administration we have. There are going to be needs for defense and certainly for energy and all of these sorts of things. And I know, too, that our government was founded on this idea that industry and business has a responsibility associated with the freedoms that they're allowed in this capitalistic culture and system, that they have responsibilities for taking on some of the things that need to happen to sustain our society. And so I'm wondering if it's time to revisit that contract and talk to industry about how they need to be more responsible and contribute more to some of the basic sciences, not just the things that are going to contribute to the bottom dollar, and actually more like the medical model and some of the things that are happening with the pharmaceuticals.
Thanks for the question. I do believe that the compact needs to be revisited. There was no industrial complex of the kind we have today when it was put together. A lot has changed. Universities now are nothing like they were in right after the Second World War. Industry is here. It was not such an important player in those days. In many ways, the whole environment in which R&D gets done has changed. So I think we do need to revisit it. The problem with asking industry to play a significantly larger role in basic science has to do with their now being embedded in a global market. So as soon as you start to have these conversations, they say maybe, okay, if the walls were all up around the United States, we were all competing with one another, sorry, and the federal government could assure us a level playing field, fine. We'll be a part of it. We'll be a bigger part of it. But very quickly now, when you have that conversation, they say, well, wait a minute. First of all, my company is multinational. It's controlled in another part of the world, or we're competing with people in another part of the world. So it's just a more complicated situation in which industry finds itself. So I think steps like increasing the research and experimentation tax credit, that's a step in the right direction. That will encourage industry to spend more money on basic science. Some of it may be in universities, and I hope that is the case. But I believe because of the constraints on future funding, our model is going to have to change. I haven't tried to define a new model. I've thought about it. It always sounds silly every time I say, well, we'll have a Department of X, or we'll change the way industry or universities work together. I think we should have those sort of discussions. It's just very hard to know what's going to work best in this new environment. But I think the way we've been doing business is not going to work. We're seeing the cracks around the edges. You're seeing them on your campus and in your field and your community. And I don't see anything changing that for the better. So we need a new model. I'm not entirely sure what that new model is, but I do believe it is a much stronger international collaborative component to it than has been the case in the past.
I'm Charles McKay, Professor Emeritus and the retired Dean of the School of Science and Computer Engineering here at the university.
That's the best kind of professor, isn't it?
It is indeed, sir. This has been an excellent presentation, and this is an audience that I suspect is somewhat typical of the audiences that you would draw, people who are in very strong agreement with you. But because we have some unique opportunities in this election year, we're going to find opportunities to perhaps influence more than just the choice of a president, but of other people who will be coming into office at all forms of government levels. How would you advise people such as those of us in this audience to be most effective in influencing the future directions of R&D expenditures, priorities, policies for this country?
That's a really good question. Some of us will be working with campaigns, and I think, we'll be watching for those opportunities. I believe science and technology is underrepresented in all of the policy circles. There are very few people in Congress that have technical degrees of any kind, and most members of Congress are still proud of the fact they don't know anything. They don't know a quark from a genome, and they'll say that kind of jokingly. And I smile because you always smile at Congressman. But I think in all these offices, that's something I believe we need to keep in mind, so that whether we're voting for somebody or we are working for a candidate or we are advising a campaign, or we're just talking to fellow citizens about sitting down in coffee or in the Rotary Club or the League of Women's Voters or churches or other organizations talking about it, I think it would help if we at least get science and technology inserted. And it doesn't mean that all these people need to be scientists. They just need to respect the integrity of science and the power of science and technology, and realize that whatever they're going to be doing in policy, they need to be aware of the scientific underpinnings and technological capability that will allow that to happen or not happen. If we all sort of nudge the electorate over and the people who are running and so forth, over time, no magic bullet, but over time, I think some good will come from it. Thank you.
You have a question?
My name is Brandon Wardlaw, and I'm just a lowly high school student.
That's a very important place to be. That's where I met my wife.
There are some critics of the state of intellectual property law in the United States that basically say that due to legislation, case law, and overzealous enforcement of patents by corporations, that the U.S. Science sector is in trouble, basically because the classic idea of intellectual property isn't really adapting to what is necessary to keep the U.S. dynamic. Do you believe that's true?
It's a very good question, and it's a technical question in areas I don't know much about, let me first say. But so the comments I can make is, I think our patent laws are really out of sync with the rest of the world, and they really need to be revisited. It's an old law. When that law was written, when nobody was thinking about genes, let alone many other things that went between one direction and the other. And as you know, gene patenting, just that one issue, has been extraordinarily messy, and now patents are being pulled back on genes where patents were given some years ago. Our patent system has been based on not whether something is right or not, whether somebody is right or not. I mean, it all has to, you make your claim, and if you're the first to make the claim, well, you get the patent. perhaps that's an overstatement, but not a very careful law. Also, this other issue of first to file versus first to find. We're a first to find, I guess. You got to prove that. First to file is a very clear intellectual property issue, and the world is in different places on this. We're not going to compete very well in the world market unless we get our intellectual property straightened out. But the other thing about intellectual property is it often gets seriously in the way of scientific progress because it allows companies and individuals, in some cases, to lock up important scientific knowledge and keep it from the science community that could run with it, that could make the next step. And often that's in the case of health and medicine, where actually people's lives could be saved if you didn't lock up the technology. So I don't have a solution to that, but I think those two issues, among a lot of others, make that a law that really needs to be revisited. And the Gathering Storm report I talked about does talk a little bit about intellectual property, and policy changes need to be made. Thank you.
We have 3 more questions.
Hi, I'm Janice Meyer, Assistant Professor of Science Education here at UHCL. And you mentioned K-12 education quite a bit in some of your slides, and I was just curious, for advice to me as a science educator, what would you see as the most critical need in K-12 education, especially in the sciences?
Teachers, quality training of teachers, retraining opportunities, time, which our teachers don't have, but teachers in Japan do, and in China and other parts of the world. Support, of course, in the community, respect and so forth. So support, I guess, of teachers. A lot of other issues. There are problems in the streets. There are problems in the homes. Hard to solve everybody's problem. But teachers are on the front line, and often, especially in the public school system, especially in less off communities, the teachers are overworked. They're overpapered in terms of bureaucracy. They don't have time. They're over directed in terms of what they're allowed to teach and not teach, how they can teach, how they can't teach. The way you teach science, I think, based on research, is exploration. I mean, you have kids in a room, you give them an opportunity to ask questions, try things, you're there with them, make sure they don't get hurt, help them along the way, because you know where you want them to go, but you don't want to get up the blackboard and lecture to them. We could use a little more of that in my university, too, a little more, less blackboard lecturing and a little more serious teaching of science. That's the way I understand from teachers I know say it works. And I've been in those classrooms. Extraordinary. I've been in classrooms like that where I look around the room, and here's a tough kid over here. I mean, he's got all kinds of things hanging on him, and he's sour-faced. People aren't sitting around him, so forth. So the class can talk about the arm. What's the arm? The mechanics of the arm and so forth. And so they go through it, and they've got a little exercise sheet and things they're supposed to do. He's not paying attention to it. And the kids at the other tables are doing this, and then pretty soon I saw him, like that. And then he looks at it, and teacher goes over, and they have a conversation. I mean, it's hard to break through to some young people, given what they're living with and what they're living through. That's the way to teach. That takes resources. Teacher has to have time. It's also high risk from a point of view. Teacher doesn't have as much control, as I understand the situation, under those circumstances, as if nobody talk. Here's what I'm telling you. Now take out your books and do the following and so forth. This is different. Kid might ask any question. Maybe I don't know the answer, especially since I'm teaching biology and my degree was in something else. Physics, for God's sakes, but okay, something else. So I think a lot of the recommendations in the Gathering Storm report are directly focused on what teaching research says about what we need. And I don't know any magic bullet. I mean, it's just going to take resources and some time. Thank you.
Samina Masood from physics faculty.
Yeah, can you pull the mic down a little bit?
Yes.
I'm very old.
Okay. Actually, I guess we have been talking about a lot of things like how to develop a better system to attract more students and how to do more to handle, develop science education in general. But there is one other thing which is, I guess, very important, that how to make best use of the existing manpower in general, female
Yes.
power also. And for that purpose, I think there is one thing which is very important in this regard is that there should be better communication between different organizations, universities, training institutes, schools, and institutes like NASA and other institutes. And in that case, sometimes what happens is that people have ability to do different kind of jobs or different kind of works. But what happens is that they don't know that what is really needed at the moment. So as a result of it, we have experts, but they don't get jobs because they don't know how they can utilize their existing abilities. At the same time, they don't know how they introduce themselves, and people cannot, or the organizations cannot find where to find the expertise. So in that case, even with the existing talent, we cannot really make best use of it. And I think it is, this is what I would like to especially mention, that if there is a good communication between schools, colleges, universities, and even other organizations, there should be sometimes gatherings, or sometimes there should be kind of meetings where people can get to know each other or what is needed. And this way, with the minimum funding, sometimes we can do that, because there is another issue that, as you mentioned, that tenure track positions are not available mostly, and people cannot apply for funding. But this way, there could be things probably which can be arranged for that purpose.
Thank you very much. I don't think I could add to what you say. I agree totally. But it has to do a little bit with what I said about changes I think we need to make in the system. We are very inefficient because we lose the opportunity for the activities over here to add to the activities over here. Now, our founding, I showed you Benjamin Franklin. It's his fault. And he's not here to defend himself. The country we put together is as disaggregated as any government you can conceive of. It was done on purpose. So we have this federal system of different agencies with different responsibilities and overlapping areas of responsibility, and coordination is just almost impossible at that level. The federal funding level. There are a lot of grassroots activities that take place that are important, and in communities like this where NASA is a major presence, NASA cares about education of kids and everybody else, and they have outreach programs, but they can't do too much of that. They can't justify very much money, and neither can the other agencies in these issues. They're always considered, almost goodwill things or community building things, outreach activities. They're always attachments, and they can sometimes be very important and very good, but they're not coordinated among agencies. We could have an NSF Institute right here, and NASA sitting over here, and those two agencies not interacting at all about anything. They're in the same appropriation bill, so they actually compete for money. They're not totally unfriendly to one another, although there are days. They're both trying to do similar kind of things. They all care about the same thing, but we're missing some real efficiencies and some opportunities by not having this coordination. So I think I've spoken about it sort of at the federal level, because that's where a lot of the money trickles down to make some of these things happen. We need what you just described. It's present in some communities, and it's often a grassroots effort. Sometimes it comes out of federal funding where it's an explicit requirement of a particular grant or cooperative agreement. We need to do more of it, no question about it, and coordination is, I think, something that needs to be greatly improved in the federal government. It could hardly be less coordinated than it is right now. So I would take some risks, because there's no damage you could possibly do to the coordination.
We have one last question.
Thank you. My name is Julie Ebersole. I'm a geophysicist with a local oil company. I was curious about an independent science advisory body for Congress, and if you had any insight into whether we might see one of those recreated again.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. So the question is about independent scientific advice to Congress. The executive branch has lots of advice. All the federal agencies, even though they're not coordinated, they have their own advisory systems. The president has a science advisor. The science advisor has an office of about 60 people called the Office of Science Technology Policy. They feed information and help the science advisor answer the president's questions, even if he hasn't asked it yet. So That's that kind of, that's the situation. Executive branch is in pretty good shape. Some amount of coordination even at the White House level, different agencies and so forth. Congress has nothing. Zero. They used to have the Office of Technology Assessment. My predecessor in the White House, Jack Gibbons, was a distinguished head of that agency. It was a congressional agency. It did kind of that. Congress asked a question, it gave Congress independent advice, and it did it pretty quickly, pretty efficiently. Now, it gave some congressmen advice they didn't want to hear, and they shut it down when Gingrich came to town after the election of 1994. One of the things he said he was going to do is shut that agency down. That was on the list of Contract for America. Do you remember Contract for America? Nothing got done on the list except that one thing. They shut down the only really good thing on the list that we needed. We need to recreate it. I also think Congress could do with a convening, if you like, a coordination. House and Senate, I mean, that's just like sin when you say that. I mean, I thought that House members and Senate members would actually come together in anything other than trying to hammer out really difficult issues or talk about impeachment is quite impossible to conceive. But they need that. They need independent advice. They don't have it, and they make some terrible mistakes. Also, things get stuck there that shouldn't be. So the executive branch has its own challenges, but it has some mechanisms in place. Congress has nothing. They have hearings. They invite who they want to tell them what they want to hear from the people they invite, and that's the end of objective, independent advice. Some of the hearings are quite good. Some of the advice they get is quite good, but it's not uniform and it's not coordinated in any way. Thank you. I hope you'll tell them to do it. Thank you for your question. I appreciate it. Yes. It's my colleague, Israel Galvan, who's introduced earlier. He knows orders of magnitude more about the political process than I do, and he's a great citizen and supporter of science technology in America. Thank you for being here. You forgot what it was.
You showed some slides here, the first slide. What do you attribute the big gap in funding between the health science, life sciences, and the hard sciences? What do you attribute?
Well, physics doesn't have a public constituency. Physics doesn't have any lobbying organization that I know about that's effective. So there's not, in the case of health sciences, first of all, members of Congress are getting older. They have all kinds of diseases, and so there's that issue. It's easy to say we're gonna win the war on cancer. I know what that means. I care about it because I got ill people in my family. I may be ill. I get it. Well, we're going to find the Higgs boson. I mean, it doesn't have it excites me, but it doesn't have the same ring to it. And I think it's almost as simple as that. Structurally, it's different because, the NIH budget was supported by a number of different patient advocacy groups. They're lobbying groups. They're one for cancers, one for heart, one for Parkinson's, very different diseases. They're well organized. They work very hard. It's remarkable that they haven't been able to keep the funding up, given how powerful those groups have been. This administration is not all that pro-health science, medicine, because to some people that's the conservative wing of this party. That sounds kind of like stem cells, what Neal was talking about, and cloning and abortion and all kinds of words that we don't want any money getting anywhere near. I think when it comes to a particular administration, there are partisan issues involved here. But structurally, they have a strong lobbying organization. The pharmaceutical companies depend on NIH funding for some of their basic research. But interesting enough, they're not always there when you want them. Some of them you might expect to support stem cell research, see that as leading to cures that will hurt their bottom line because of drugs that they make their money on. There's difficult business ethics to deal with here, and that's a circumstance. So I think it's really that NIH Biomedical Research is about health. It's just put it simply, winning the war on cancer. And that people get that. They understand that. The case for physics, chemistry, biology, it supports everything, but to many people, if you're supporting everything, you're not supporting anything. I don't quite understand it. I'll put my money over here where we're going to cure cancer.
As you probably will remember, the late Rich Smalley was on a bandwagon there from Boston, that he wanted to increase, I think he said he wanted to
Yeah, I think that's... And I think we're going to need more of that. That's a pretty good, that's a reasonable factor. We don't want it all at once or we'll run into the NIH problem, but not a bad factor to work with, and we do miss Rick Smalley. Thank you for those comments, Israel.
We have one last question. One last question.
Dr. Lane, we enjoyed your presentation very much. Since you are so close to NASA, I thought I'll ask one space-related question. We all have read that China has sent a satellite towards moon, and so has Japan, and India is going to send one. You also mentioned in your talk about offshoring and outsourcing, and you work on space policy as well. What are your thoughts on the future space exploration as we go forward in this nation, about the role of all these global factors that are coming to bear on this important endeavor that we have in our nation?
I believe that space exploration and space science really need to be global, and examples of U.S. cooperation with other countries for a couple of reasons. It's space. Nobody owns it. We're not going to own it. We don't want China to own it. We don't want Russia to own it. Second thing is we can't afford, I believe we'll not be able to afford space exploration that's currently in people's minds without that kind of degree of cooperation. Now, how to get that is very tricky, because there are people in the Pentagon that think our next war is going to be with China. It's going to be in space. We're going to shoot down their satellites. They're going to shoot down our satellites. We got to be ready. Well, getting ready in that way makes it really kind of difficult to cooperate on peaceful uses of space. As you know, there was Congressman Cox wrote a report, really an absolutely outrageous example of incompetence in the U.S. Congress. Representative Cox wrote a report about the coming dangers of China, and he was talking about the possibility that China got some secrets from us through the exchange of some information from one company to Chinese colleagues over a failed launch. And while he was investigating this, the Wen-Ho Lee case came up. And boy, he grabbed that and ran with it. Man, he got headlines, more outrageous stuff. And as you know, the Wen-Ho Lee case, Los Alamos case, the alleged Chinese spy, totally fell apart. There was some misbehavior suggested and probably true, but nothing, no spy found, no secret information found to have leaked out and so forth. So that was the end of Representative Cox and his view, not the end of him, but the end of his sort of tirade here. That stuff goes on in the Congress. And so there's a strong anti-China feeling around the town, and some legitimate concerns about economic competition and all kinds of legitimate concerns about such a rising power. There are places we need to be competitive with China. There are places we need to be partners. I would say the peaceful use of space is a perfect place for a partnership. So we welcome the Chinese and they welcome us. All has to be worked out privately first, but then we both welcome one another to the partnership, and we're short of doing that yet. When we announced the President's space exploration program, it was very clear. This can be a U.S.-run program. We're going back to the moon, on to Mars. There was some suggestion if other nations would like to participate, we'd be glad to hear from them. Send us your resumes. This is not really how you start the next phase of space exploration, which could be enormously exciting in the next several decades. So yes, cooperation, and I would like to think the next administration, whoever it is, will take that position with regard to space.
Okay, we'd like to thank Dr. Lane.
Thank you.
Also, I'd like to welcome everybody to a reception that's being held downstairs, sponsored by the School of Business and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation.